Welcome to the first episode of the AI Tomorrow podcast, a bi-weekly podcast from the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. In each episode, we will be exploring topics related to AI safety, ethics of AI, and consciousness. I'm your host, Bartłomiej Pohorecki, and the following is a conversation with Bill Hibbard, one of the most interesting minds in the AI community. He holds a Ph.D. in computer science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has a great interest in AI safety. AI Tomorrow podcast is available on all streaming platforms, including YouTube. I hope you enjoy this episode. What is your background in artificial intelligence?
Okay, I was interested in math from the time before I was 10 years old. I was interested in computers from my early teens. I took my first artificial intelligence course in 1969 when I was at the University of Wisconsin. And I decided not to make my career in artificial intelligence because it was, pretty speculative at that point. But in 1980, I wrote a program for playing the board game Othello, sometimes called Reversi. And my program was based on uh, a checkers program. Oh God, I'm zoning out on the guy's name. There's a guy at IBM, Arthur Samuels, who wrote a checkers program in 1960. So my Othello program was sort of patterned after his checkers program, and it was a learning program. So when I first turned my program on and played against it, it was laughably easy for me to beat it. And then my program spent 2 weeks playing games against itself, learning to be a better Othello player. And at the end of those 2 weeks, no one at my center, my scientific center, Space Science Engineering Center, could beat it. In those 2 weeks of learning, it had gone from being terrible to being unbeatable. So that really convinced me of the value of machine learning. But I still didn't do anything very significant with artificial intelligence. But as my career doing computer visualization was winding down around the year 2000, I became more interested in AI. Plus, AI was beginning to heat up. And so I started writing papers. I wasn't trying to build AI. I realized I could never compete with Google and the likes of them. So I got involved in the AGI community, artificial and general intelligence, the work of Marcus Hooter and others. You could say that I'm a follower of Hooter, who was at the Australian National University and at DeepMind. And then Laurent Rousseau wrote some great papers in 2011, and I responded to them with some papers in 2012. And those papers in 2012 got me some recognition. And I had some papers before that. I had a paper in paper 2008, 2009. And so then I really became part of this community, this sort of AGI community, and going to meetings. And it was not long after that, I'd say in 2015, that I realized that my mathematical talents had pretty much petered out. In 2015, I was 67 years old, and mathematical talent I became very error prone. So I decided to stop writing papers. In fact, I don't even review papers anymore. But I still take a great interest in what's going on with AI, and I take a great interest in the social aspects of it now. I think it's going to have profound influence on humanity, and so I want to say what I think about it. So that sort of brings me up to the current time.
It seems like lots of your work is focused on the superintelligence
Yes.
and the possible emergence of it. In the 80s, when you created your program, did you anticipate it back then that something like that would be possible?
Oh, yes. I would say as early as I ever thought about artificial intelligence, I realized that it was going to become more intelligent than humans. And that's because I was brought up in religion, but I would say from my early teens, I believe that human minds were purely the creation of human brains, that if physical brains were creating human minds. And if a physical system can create our minds, then our relentless technology should be able to build systems that can create minds like ours and minds better than ours. So I never in my life have I doubted that we would one day build machines more intelligent than humans. So the papers I wrote were mostly about the technical aspects of AI safety and to some extent AI ethics. So AI safety and ethics rather than trying to build AI. My focus has been safety and ethics, following, as I say, a follower of Marcus Hooter.
I found your book Super Intelligent Machines very interesting. And in the book you tend to draw from many religions to establish that that kind of powerful software would ultimately be the final expression of a god.
Yeah, that was interesting. I wrote that book in 2001. I think it was published in 2002. So I was just beginning to think about AI. So it was a sort of a learning experience to write that book. I don't think that's a particularly wonderful book, but it did seem to me that AI was going to have many of the characteristics which we normally attribute to a god. If we look at the current day, and think about what it is that humanity is building. We're building these enormous servers with AI software running in them. It's not a coincidence that the corporations that have the largest servers are also the most heavily involved in AI development. The real target for AI is not some little robot or car. It's these enormous servers. That's where AI is going to really live. It's going to be in these huge servers. And those servers are connected by the internet to basically every human being. I mean, it's true that the internet now currently only reaches, what is it, 60 or 70% of humanity, but it's relentlessly working its way. And if you look at Europe, the United States, China, the internet pretty much reaches everybody. And so we have these AI and these big servers connected via the internet, and it goes out to at every human being. There's a phone, uh, or a laptop, or some cameras, some sort of devices where the AI servers can communicate with individual humans. And so what we're building is these enormous AI things that communicate simultaneously with entire populations. And AI learns to predict, and so the AI is, by surveilling all these humans and surveilling the social relations between humans, the AI is learning to build a model of human society, or at least of human societies within individual nations. And so it's going to have godlike powers relative to individuals who are part of that society. I mean, if you look at what's happening in China, they understand this very well. So a AI server that has the ability to surveil and control populations fits very well with the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. And so, they believe in maintaining a orderly, peaceful, and hopefully just society, and they're willing to employ whatever means are necessary to do that. And so AI is perfect for that. And even in other societies like the US or Europe, I think we're very likely to see AI having godlike powers. It's a question of to what extent are the societies willing to limit those godlike powers. That's the big question. So AI is really the ultimate, in my opinion, AI is the most important political issue of the 21st century.
Machine learning algorithms tend to have lots of impact on everyday lives of lots of Americans, and even
Yeah.
even in Asia it seems to be even maybe more prevalent.
Yeah.
But in your work you tend to be certain that super intelligent AI would also be somehow connected to every human if it would be created, because those machine learning algorithms they tend to just passively interact with us, but it seems like we would have very active interactions with super intelligent AI. But I do have doubts about that because it seems like a super intelligent AI could create its own more efficient language and just decide not to interact with us because it would regard us as inferior beings. What are your views on that? Would you say that it would interact with us, or perhaps are we going to be always limited to those machine learning algorithms, which are usually designed to extort something from us?
Well, it comes down to the motivation of the AI. I mean, with animals and humans, we have the motivation. The big question with any human is, what is the motivation? It's something that's studied. And if you look at artificial intelligence, you have motivation. The actions that the AI makes have some motivation. If people are investing billions of dollars to build these AIs, and then the AIs don't act at all, the question is, what's the point of that investment? So the AIs do act, And those actions must be guided by some motivation. So I would turn the question around to you and say, what is the motivation? What do you think the motivation of the super AIs is going to be?
That is the issue I'm greatly interested in because lots of the papers I read tend to believe that our motivations are modeled on us having bodies and our need
Yes.
for survival. And I'm very interested in the idea of how greatly our mind is dependent on our need of survival and the survival of our flesh. So
Yes.
I just really cannot imagine a system that would not be dependent on that. So it's very hard for me to see if we don't model the AI on our brain, how would it even be understandable by us? And what would be the motivations of the system for
Well,
that?
AI does have a body. So there's the internet, there's all the phones and cameras. I mean, we buy phones, we buy laptops, we buy cameras. They're all connected. All these devices that are connected to the internet, refrigerators, your whole house, cars, all of these things are increasingly connected, and they are all really part of the body of the AI. When I talk to people about self-driving cars, the thing to understand about self-driving cars is at some point in the future, it's not like every car is going to be an autonomous unit. With humans, with human drivers, every car is autonomous. Every person is making isolated decisions about how to drive their car. If we come to the future where all the cars are self-driving cars, they're not going to be autonomous. All the cars are going to be controlled by a single mind, and they'll avoid accidents that way. The cars will coordinate with each other. You won't even need stoplights. That'll all be in the brain of the AI that's controlling all the cars. So it'll be really a social brain. It will not be each car for itself, but the AI will be controlling all the cars. The cars will flow around each other without ever running into each other. I mean, when I give a talk about this, I tell as a joke of me as a stubborn old man who insists he's driving his own car, right? So I'm coming down the street, and then all the other cars are self-driving cars, and they see me coming, this old man, this unpredictable old man. They see me coming, and all the self-driving cars just get out of my way, because they can't predict what I'm going to do. I'm just a crazy human. So, well, all right. So the cars though are become the body of the AI, and all the other devices that are connected by the internet to these AI servers, they really constitute the body of the AI, you know, and even on a phone, if you're talking with your AI, the phone talking to you is like a mouth of the AI. A human has two eyes, two ears, and one mouth. AI may have billions of mouths, each speaking to a person, and my mouth is part of my body, so the AI is going to be talking to all these people, and that the speaker in your phone will be part of the AI's body.
That would lead me to believe that the AI would be focused on preserving its own servers.
Well, so in 2008 at the AGI meeting, Steve Omohundro presented a paper, The Basic AI Motives, in which he talked about that the an AI, no matter what motives you give an AI, there will be some derived motives of preserving itself, because if it dies, if it ceases to exist, then it will not be able to pursue whatever motives we've given it. So self-preservation is seen in Steve's work as an inherent motive. But other people have the subject of AI safety has come a long ways in the 13 years since then, and there's ways to design it where you can sort of factor out that self-preservation business. Uh, and so we're we really have a great deal of freedom when we design these AIs to give them the motives we want. And the research, I contributed a little bit to that research. The research has been very active in understanding how to avoid pitfalls in designing the motivations of AI. And so, I mean, it's still something we have to take seriously. It's still something we have to worry about, but there's a lot of progress on that. So I think from my point of view, I'll sort of assume that problem can be solved, and that we can design an AI with whatever motives we want, and that we don't have to worry too much. We have to worry about it, but we will solve the problem of how to avoid the AI doing things that we don't want it to do.
I'm also interested in the issue of the motivations because it seems like human motivations are based on our perception of time. We want to achieve them in our lifetime, and it seems to me that a machine would not have any perception of time. I suppose it would probably want to achieve them as soon as possible, but I'm just not sure if the idea of motivations could be embedded in a machine if it does not have this kind of perception
Oh, oh,
of reality. Could it be
oh,
possible?
yeah. Sure, sure. A machine, I think a machine will perceive time. I mean, time is pretty fundamental to existence. An AI that's driving a car has to have a perception of time because it knows where the car is now and has to predict where the car will be. It sees other cars. It needs to predict where those other cars will be. If you have one large AI mind driving all the cars, it has it has a goal of where each car has to go to, what's the destination of each car, and it has to plan out the routes of each car so that they don't intersect, that they don't hit each other at all possible future times. So I think there's no reason why AI can't be perceived time. In fact, I mean, it's pretty essential. A mind that had no perception of time could hardly be called intelligence. Or think of a chess program. It's thinking about a simple-minded chess program. It's thinking about the future, so it's thinking about time, sort of implicitly. A lot of those chess programs aren't really very intelligent. They're just enormous calculations. Of course, all intelligence is really an enormous calculation, but you know what I mean. So I think time is part of intelligence and part of, I mean, so we think about what is intelligence fundamentally. So what intelligence is an agent that learns a model of the environment by interacting with the environment. So an agent interacts with the environment and learns a model of the environment. And then it uses that environment to predict the consequences of its possible actions. And then it chooses the action that produces the desired consequences. So prediction is really pretty fundamental to intelligence, and prediction is essentially about time.
I read that your guess is that people will develop intelligent machines around the year 2100.
Yeah, by then. I think it'll happen by that time, but it might happen sooner. Ray Kurzweil, in his book, The Singularity is Near, predicts that we get the human level AI by 2029. That's only 8 years from now. So that's pretty soon. It depends on how much faith you have in that. I mean, the thing about AI is just really smart people are working on it. You go to DeepMind, you go to OpenAI, you're gonna find, or other branches of Google, you're gonna find really smart people, smartest people in the world, among the smartest people in the world. I suppose really smart people are also working in biology. And they have practically unlimited budgets because the stakes are so high. Getting to super intelligent AI is a huge advantage for whoever does it. And so they're spending incredible amounts of money. The field is attracting very smart people. So progress is really cranking along. Um, and I don't know exactly when it happens, but I'm pretty confident it'll happen by the year 2100. And if it doesn't happen by the year 2100, pretty amazing stuff is going to happen by then. I mean, I'm going to be 73 next month, so I'm getting up there. But maybe if I'm lucky, I have 17 more years of life. I'll maybe live till be 90. And I think in those 17 years, we're going to see some really far out stuff. I'm confident. I mean, think about what's been happening in the last 10 years. Crazy stuff. Not only the pandemic, the election of really crazy people to high political office, all kinds of other craziness going on in the world, in financial markets, what's going on with China, a lot of really crazy stuff. And I expect it to just get crazier and crazier.
You are an advocate of an open source AI, although you do
Yes.
mention that the companies that are doing research regarding artificial intelligence, they just pump in so much money. Is
Yeah.
it feasible to expect that they would then just also give out it as an open source project?
Well, some of them, so OpenAI, think about OpenAI. I mean, the name of the company suggests a certain openness, although they made a decision a couple of years ago. there's all this AI fakery, where you can create an AI that looks like you or me, and then put words into our mouth. And so they had developed some software for that. And so they were a little reluctant to make that open source because they didn't want to give anybody the ability to do those kind of fakes. But the basic, the name of the company suggests that they're very much into openness. And also think about at least Google when it was founded, you know, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, they were pretty into openness, not necessarily open source for everything, but a degree of openness. There's been a fair degree of openness by the DeepMind people, although a few months ago there was an article in The Guardian sort of taking DeepMind to task for lack of openness. So we'll see what happens there. But I believe that the potential social consequences of AI are so enormous that that if people want to maintain anything resembling the freedoms that we currently enjoy, say in the West, in the U.S. and Europe, freedom of speech and so on, this AI is an instrument for controlling society. And so if we want to avoid some mysterious unknown person using the power of AI to control society, we need to know what it's doing. If in the absence of transparency, it's inevitable that AI, this tool of AI for controlling society, will be employed by whatever powerful people control the AI. My worry about AI is not that humanity will lose control and AI will be independent of humanity. My worry is that that AI will be a tool for some individuals to control society. And so the defense against that is transparency, for us to really know what it's doing, how it works, and what it's being used for, what its motivations are. We talked about AI motivation. Unless we can really know what the motivations of these big AIs, whether they're in China or the US or wherever, you know, it's not going to turn out well. We need to know what they're doing.
The danger here is, in my opinion, that United States perhaps might be open about it if you're
Yeah,
optimistic, but then
right.
some other states or some
Yeah,
other organizations might just take the source code,
right.
manipulate it, and benefit from the research that was
Sure.
done. How could we make sure that wouldn't happen?
That's a good question. I mean, and I'm aware of that problem. I used to, back in a number of years ago, when I'd write my papers, in the conclusion, I would always say AI is becoming the essential tool for military, economic, and political competitions among humans, and therefore is going to be hard to control. And that's absolutely right. So if I'm sitting here saying we need to be open about AI, but the leadership in the US sees AI as the primary domain of competition with China, they're not going to want to do it. And you can see in Europe where there really aren't large AI companies in Europe, but they can see what's happening in the US and China. So Europe has the general data protection regulation and other strong efforts to control what AI is doing and to get transparency in the AI. Maybe the hope is that because Europe has not had any really large AI players, maybe the hope for safe AI rests with Europe. And Europe, because Europe is such a large market, maybe Europe can insist that AIs from China and the US play by the rules that the people in Europe set. It's a kind of a long shot. I have to admit, I'm not terribly optimistic about the future, just because it's going to be hard to have openness with AI when it's a subject of international competition.
So, what are the other ways that we can make sure AI wouldn't be used for malicious purposes?
Well, people really need to insist on openness, on transparency. To me, that's what it comes down to. People need to understand the magnitude of what's coming. When I think about AI, I think of a group of children playing on a beach. There's a group of children, they have their little shovels, their little buckets, they're playing in the sand. And meanwhile, 1,000 miles out in the ocean, there's a tsunami coming. and these children are playing on the beach and the tsunami is coming. And it's like, what can we do about this? They're unaware. The kids are just having a good time. They're unaware that the tsunami is coming. It's not a perfect analogy because we already see some of the precursors to the AI coming, all the craziness we see in society. A lot of it is due to automation. You know, in the US, we have great social dislocation because of the automation, the manufacturing industry and the car manufacturing industry and so on. So we see some signs of it, but so it's coming and people really are unaware. People need to be more aware and people need to be more focused on what to do about it. You know, we need hopefully political leadership that will help to alert people to what's coming and the need for openness with AI. Unfortunately, these big tech industry and the banking industry are all very cozy with politicians, and that's all over the world. You know, even in China. Of course, in China, things are turned upside down. It's not that it's not that the rich companies are buying the government. It's more like the government has got the rich companies by the short hairs, but it's essentially the same kind of deal. You have this sort of alliance between the political leadership and the corporate leadership. And we really need um, leaders who will tell people, no, we got to know what's going on with AI. We need to have transparency. You know, I don't know. It's a tough thing, and I have very little taste for politics. So it's really a political question. It's a political problem, and I have zero desire to get involved really in politics. I'm old. I'm turned off by the whole mess.
I was also wondering because you mentioned the automation and that it's a big problem. And when I
Yeah.
think about the possible emergence of super intelligent AI, it seems like that would make us humans obsolete in many ways because any task could be performed better. And where do we go from there? There is this book called Super Luxury Automated Communism, which explores those topics in a funny way. But I'm just wondering, there are some people who are advocates for UBI. Would you say that's a good idea? Where do we go from the moment where just any task performed by a human can be performed easily by a machine?
Yeah, UBI is a great idea. So among the candidates in the recent presidential election, Andrew Yang was out there promoting that idea. Now hopefully there's a good chance he'll be elected as a mayor of New York City. Uh, and there's a transition. I mean, the old economy isn't dead. So the old market-based economy isn't dead. There's still a place for it. I mean, the great lesson of the 20th century was that market economies outperform command economies. We saw it very clearly in the Cold War. And that's the lesson that the Chinese took to heart. They would struggle along with a command economy for a long time, and then they got smart and they said, oh, we need to have a market economy. And then their economy took off. But the big thing in China is, yes, these corporations can become very powerful, but they can't challenge the Communist Party for political control. And there's still room. We haven't reached the point yet where the entire economy is automated. We're far from that. And so there's still a room for a market economy. So it's going to take careful management. We need economic leaders who understand that there's how to properly make the transition from a market economy to more of a where everyone just gets a check and from market economy to an automated economy. We're gonna make that transition gradually, and we need to understand how to soften the social blow. In fact, governments that don't figure out how to do that are going to face such incredible social unrest. It's going to be impossible for them to govern. I don't know. Some of these topics are a little bit over my head. I'm not really an economist.
We can go back to the topic of intelligence itself. In your book, you mentioned that the book is from 2002, so perhaps you can also correct me if you don't believe that anymore. But I quote, you said, "I think that people will accept machines as intelligent when they can not only beat them at chess, but also do chores for them, with independence and converse with them in a natural
Yeah.
way.
Yes.
But this could be an emulation and not actual understanding. There is a
Um,
famous Chinese room argument. What are your views on
yeah,
that?
yeah. Yeah, right. That argument isn't very convincing to me. I mean, what's the difference? If it if it can do everything that a human being can do, why do we care that much about what's going on inside of it? You know, the people who design it will know how to design motivations for it. And if it can behave intelligently to to pursue those motives, doesn't matter. So have you ever studied Marcus Hooter's Universal AI, sometimes called AIXI?
Could you explain to the listeners what is that about?
Okay, it's an abstract a mathematical framework for thinking about intelligence, and it's based on Solomonoff's induction. Ray Solomonoff came up with this idea of sequence induction. I don't want to get too much into the details of it, but it, it's a mathematical abstraction for a way to think about intelligence. And so a lot of the AI safety work has taken place within that framework. So Laurent Rousseau and Mark Ring had a couple of really great papers at the AGI 11 conference in which they took that framework and used it to analyze AI safety questions. And I've written papers, and a whole lot of other people. Hooter's student, Tom Everett, wrote a PhD in which he tried to sort of summarize all the previous work along these lines.
Could you maybe describe that framework?
So you have an agent interacting with an environment, and the agent makes observations of the environment and then has actions on the environment. So the agent acts on the environment and gets observations on the environment and also gets rewards from the environment, which may be food or whatever. So what the agent tries to do is it tries to learn to predict the environment. So that's where Solomonoff's theory of sequence prediction comes in. So you get a sequence of observations and rewards from the environment in response to actions by the agent. And the agent builds a mathematical model of the environment. The mathematical model is a probability distribution over programs for a universal Turing machine. So you know universal Turing machines, universal Turing machine. If you're familiar with that,
My background is more so in philosophy.
yes.
That it would be great if you could explain because it's very interesting.
Yeah. So Alan Turing was the great prophet. Wrote a paper in what 1950 about artificial intelligence. So he was the great prophet of artificial intelligence, and he invented this mathematical abstraction of computation called Turing machines. I really can't go into too much detail about all this stuff, but I would highly recommend to try to learn something about this stuff. And so uh, it gets kind of mathematical. It's a little bit tough to present in a podcast. But let's say what's happening in Hooter's Universal AI is it's coming up. It's observing the environment, it's getting observations and rewards from environment response to actions. It's creating a mathematical model. So this mathematical model is like the best possible prediction, the best possible explanation, I should say, for the observations and rewards that it gets. And then once it can predict the environment, then it chooses rewards that give it the greatest possible future. It chooses actions that give it the greatest possible future rewards. You know, so it's simple conceptually, but it's a nice it gives you a mathematical handle on intelligence. So now you can do mathematics even though you can't build an AI, you can do mathematics on intelligence using Hooter's framework.
It seems like you do not believe that there is much difference between human consciousness and robot consciousness. Is that correct?
Well, no, I don't think there's any robots yet that are conscious. And Hooter's model of intelligence is not conscious. I mean, it's pretty hard to look at that model and see where consciousness would be. So it's a different approach to intelligence than consciousness. What I think about consciousness is Hooter's universal AI is not computationally efficient. In fact, it's really mathematically impossible. It requires an infinite amount of computation. And there are finitely computable approximations, but even those require enormous amounts of computation. So it may be that the way to get to intelligence that is computationally feasible is by building minds that are conscious. I mean, think about what our consciousness does. It remembers the past. We can remember the past. In our mind, we can bring back the past. We've had past experiences. We observe the environment, we act in the environment, and then we can replay those experiences in our mind because of our consciousness. We can sort of go back and relive those things. And the other thing we can do with our consciousness is we can live possible futures. We can imagine a future, and we can use our consciousness is kind of our model of the environment, and we can use our consciousness to predict what the world is going to do in response to our actions. So our consciousness is kind of doing what Hooter's mathematical model is doing, but it's different. And so, I think consciousness to me is possibly the best or only way to make a computationally efficient or computationally feasible intelligence, but not. I'm convinced you can have intelligence without consciousness.
I was just wondering because you said it's possible to create intelligence without consciousness.
Yes.
Would you say that there could be a super intelligent AI without consciousness?
Yes, I think that's possible.
Do you think that's your prediction? That's what's most likely going to happen, or is it impossible to say?
I don't know. I think it's very likely that a super AI will be conscious. I think it's going to be solved. I think people are going to figure out how to implement consciousness. I mean, the progress in neuroscience, the progress in artificial intelligence is tremendous. These problems are going to be solved.
If we could move to the topic of AI ethics now, that would be great. I'm just wondering because you seem to be quite optimistic. Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I read that you believe that super intelligent machines would want humans to lead quality lives. Is that something you still stand for?
If it's part of their motive. I mean, humans will design the motives of artificial intelligence. And so what they want to do is going to depend on what motives we give them.
Humans, despite being embedded in the values we would like an ethical AI to have, still cause a lot of suffering. How can we ensure that the same wouldn't happen with AI? Because we can give AI the set of values we'd like it to have, but we believe that we have those values, and we still tend to cause lots of suffering to other humans in our lifetimes.
Yes, right. I mean, that's the big problem. Is there's a great book to anyone interested in the question of how to design the motives of AI. I would suggest a book by Stuart Russell called Human Compatible. It's a really good book. And that book actually, I suggested similar ideas in a couple of my papers back in 2012, but I didn't do nearly as good a job as Stuart Russell did, and I missed some important points. And by the way, there's a long paper I wrote. I put it on ARXIV. It's called Ethical Artificial Intelligence. It's like 177 pages long. So it's basically a little book that I put on ARXIV, Ethical Artificial Intelligence, in which I lay out. So I realized that my ability to write technical papers was coming to a close. So I sort of took all the papers I had written and strung them together and tried to make a coherent narrative out of them in this book. But Stuart Russell presents a lot of the same ideas in his book, Human Compatible.
Would it be possible for you to expand on those ideas? Maybe summarize the most important points from the book?
Yeah, the idea is that you have an AI that it doesn't really start out with a specific set of motives. It starts out with the idea that it's going to learn what it is that humans want. It's going to learn its motivations by studying humans and seeing what it is that we want. And so initially, it's supposed to be kind of humble. It's not supposed to be acting very strongly because it starts out with the idea that it doesn't really know what humans want. So it's supposed to start out with a certain humility. I don't really understand, but I'm just going to try to study these humans, see what it is they want, and it's going to learn what they want, and it's going to learn what they want by observing them. It's going to learn what humans want by observing them, and then it's going to, as it becomes more and more confident that it knows what it is that humans want, it's going to try to give it to them. And of course, there's all kinds of very complex issues in this, because humans are often incompatible in what they want. There's often a conflict, between what people want. You can see it in our politics. You can see it in our economy. A lot of disagreements. So the system has to have some way of balancing the disagreement, and in particular, protecting minority rights of people who are sort of small, small groups of people who want something. How do you protect that? So it's very complex, but you can sort of, and in fact, I laid out a very similar vision in my book, Ethical Artificial Intelligence. It was based on a paper in 2012, and then this book was written in 2014, 2015, and I sort of lay the whole thing out. And it's very mathematical. It's all written in Hooter's framework, so it gets pretty mathematical. And one of the basic ideas, and it's an idea that Stuart Russell describes in his book, and I describe also in my book, is the idea that you play possible futures to humans. You let humans see possible futures, and you ask them one way or another what they think about those futures. And of course, you can't actually do that with real humans, so you make models of humans. You get models of humans, and then you let the models of humans play out possible futures, and you ask the model of each human how it likes that future. Is this a future you like? Is it a future you don't like? And then it takes all of humans and sort of aggregate their opinions and try to find the future that everyone likes. And of course, there's all these, there's Arrow's impossibility theorem and all kinds of other things that say that these kinds of constructions are fraught with difficulty. It's hard to do a perfect job, but nevertheless, some version of that is what I advocate and what Stuart Russell is advocating. Uh, you sort of model humanity and let your model of humanity judge what the future should be. That seems to me to be, if we're going to have a really ethical AI, that's the path we need to go down. And it's great that someone with Stuart Russell's credibility is advocating that idea, so it might be taken seriously. On the other hand, getting it through our politics is going to be a real challenge. So,
But there are lots of cultural differences between humans,
yeah,
and I just have to say, it seems like the model of a human would have to take into
right,
consideration all of the cultural
right, right.
differences.
So,
Is it possible, or do we just agree that the European system that is based on Enlightenment philosophy is just the ultimate model?
in the thing I was describing, I mean, we're not taking we're talking models of each individual human. So each individual human being is modeled. Each individual human being passes a judgment on possible futures. So you look at every individual, whatever their culture. So, if you take the issue of abortion, people who are for having abortion, their evaluations of futures are modeled. People who are against abortion, their evaluations of the future are modeled. Then somehow you have to mix them together. You know, I mean, if it turns out that there's a vast majority of humans on one side of the issue or the other, then maybe that will prevail. If it's or maybe there's can be some outside of the box way to resolve them. There's the old Hegelian, you have the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis. Some outside the box way of dealing with the problem. Um, you know, some sort of justice. So that everyone can say, well, I'm reasonably happy. Some sort of compromise. I mean, this was the great word in the founding of the U.S. democracy was compromise. When they were thinking about the U.S. Constitution, compromise was their guiding idea.
I was also wondering, because you seem to be optimistic about the possibility of creating a superintelligence machine. You seem to be almost sure that it will happen. And I was
Yes.
wondering if you could go through the most convincing argument against that happening.
Oh God. Well, I don't know any convincing arguments against it. I mean, I'm so, I'm so convinced that it will happen.
In your book, I just saw you went through a couple of them.
Yeah. Oh, did I?
But you see, yeah, but it seems like you just debunked them quite easily.
Yeah, it's like 20 years ago
So
I wrote that. I can't remember that. It's not a very good book. I
that's
can't
quite
remember.
understandable.
Sorry. The
Uh,
book I want to be remembered for is Ethical Artificial Intelligence that I put online on ARXIV. Hooter's framework is really an excellent, I mean, it's a brilliant piece of work. I got tremendous admiration for Hooter. And his framework is the right framework to be thinking about artificial intelligence. And so, you know, that's how I've expressed my ideas for quite a few years now, is in that framework.
and I think you did a good job explaining that on the podcast. So it's good
Good.
that people who are not really into mathematics will be able to understand. I have one last question for you,
Sure.
and the question is AI gonna kill us all?
No, because I don't believe that humans will not lose control of AI. There will always be some small group of humans who control AI. And it depends on that will depend on what that small group of humans want. I mean, they might want AI to kill the rest of us, or but it's not going to kill everybody, because ultimately some humans will remain in control.
But if you think about singularity, wouldn't you say that it's so easy to imagine a scenario where the system just breaks out of control?
Well, but there's all this research on AI safety, and uh, I'm optimistic that ultimately that research will succeed. It's not an impossible problem. It's a hard problem, but a lot of people have been working on it. So I think AI safety is not an impossible problem.
And you also seem to be optimistic about the value alignment problem. If we could just summarize the podcast, you seem to think that this will be figured out.
I think we will know how to do it. The question is, will we do it? And that's a political question. And that's where I think transparency comes in. So I'm not really all that optimistic, because we're going to need transparency. The public, I think if the public doesn't have some transparency about what's going on in AI, it's going to be tough to get really anything like that value alignment. It's at least not a value alignment that takes into account the opinions of all humans. You may end up with a value alignment that takes into account the values of the small group of humans who controls AI or something.
Would your advice for people who are passionate about AI ethics to be less focused on the state of the research and more so politically advocate for the AI
Transparency,
safety and AI transparency?
transparency, and I want to transparency and accountability. What we need is transparency. We need the public to know how AI works and what it is being used for. Current AIs have motivations, and they need to be completely transparent about the motivations of AIs. And this is a tough problem, because how are you going to get China to do that? So it's a really tough problem, but that's what we need.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider to like, subscribe, and share. I also recommend following the AI Tomorrow podcast account on Twitter to make sure you don't miss out on any audiograms from future episodes.